All right, we're going to start. So, if we were doing our normal AP reviews, which involved us eating pizza, sitting in my classroom, and doing stuff face to face, I would do one, maybe two whole nights just on women's rights, women's issues, and American history because it's a topic that the College Board absolutely loves. Um, so, here's the deal. You had a study guide deal on Monday. You're going to have another one. That'll be period 3 on Wednesday. I'm going to have YouTube live review tomorrow night this week. I can't do Thursday. And then on Friday in class, you're going to write a DBQ on Test Wizard. It'll be timed 45 minutes. There are 5 docs you got to use 4. Here's a hint. The DBQ is probably something about women's rights. Okay? Tomorrow night, we'll do the second half of the women's rights review and presentation. I sent you guys a Google Slides. It looks like that. If you have the ability, you might want to follow along with it. If not, refer to it. It's posted up on the classroom. Same deal. Got a lot of hyperlinks there, videos, quick little readings, images. The other thing I did was I put some primary source documents up there because we know, hey, we're writing a DBQ. So I put some primary source documents up there that are based upon tonight's topic just to try to get you to think. We want to create those skills of contextualization, think about intended audience and purpose and point of view, but more importantly, why those parts of hippos matter and why they fit with your DBQ topic. So tonight we're going to talk about periods 3, 4, and 5 when it comes to women's rights. So think of it this way. We're going from the cult of Republican motherhood through the cult of domesticity. All right. If you get a women's rights issue, we've got to be able to do some contextualization, right? We've got to do one of two things. We have to be able to either set the stage in terms of, okay, here's a point, a place in time. Here are the big overlying issues. Remember, one of the things we did early in the year was we named each time period. Period 3, 1754 to 1800. We said that's causes and effects of the American Revolution. We very purposefully named that because that means everything that you do somehow has to work into the context of causes and effects of the American Revolution. Okay? So if you're writing an essay about women's rights and it's set in period 3, somehow women's rights had to either affect the Revy or it had to be affected by the revolution. That's what we mean by that idea of contextualization. The other thing that you can do is you can do the old Wayne's World thing. Let's go back in time. And say, all right, how do we get to this point? What are the events related to this topic that have gotten us to this point? So we'll start off by doing that. How did we get to the topic of women's rights in periods 3, 4, and 5? So let's go back into period 2, which is colonial America before the Revolution. Now, we're going to do this mainly from the standpoint of the British colonies because, quite frankly, there's a lot more information about the British colonies when it comes to women's rights issues. All right, if you're following along at home, during period 2, we see the Quakers. And the Quakers are important for a lot of reasons, not just because of oatmeal and because of Philadelphia, but when William Penn creates his holy experiment, he does it in an incredibly religiously tolerant way. Now, the Quakers, they believed everybody had the ability to have knowledge of the Holy Spirit or what they called access to God's inner light, and that included women. Now, we are not going to go so far as to say that Quaker women had equality with men, because that's just not going to be the true case in the 1600s, 1700s, guys. However, Quaker women did enjoy more legal rights. Quaker women were certainly able to speak out more when it came to matters. In Massachusetts Bay, now, here's the thing about women's rights. Women's rights can fall under the scope of other issues because you can say that maybe a woman was denied the right to participate or do something because she was a woman. You have Anne Hutchinson in Massachusetts Bay. Anne Hutchinson got herself in a lot of hot water. She was teaching Bible study, okay? And she was teaching Bible study, and she taught a concept called antinomianism. Antinomianism is the idea that you don't need religious leaders to have a relationship with God, that a person can have a direct relationship with God, which, of course, now threatens the power of those religious leaders. And for her troubles, good old Annie Hutchinson, she was booted out of Massachusetts Bay. She was banished and then was ended up founding a place called Portsmouth. She founded that colony, which later became a part of a larger colony called Rhode Island. Uh, Women in colonial times. It's really important to remember they had very few rights. I've got a little hyperlink on there that explains that. Basically, think of it this way: when a woman married, she forfeited all legal claim to property. Any land she had prior to the marriage was not hers. Her children were not hers; they were her husband's. She did not have the ability to initiate a divorce. Now, as a result, what that meant was women who never got married had a lot more legal power, legal standing. If you were a widow, you had more independence than a married woman. Or if you're an older woman who never married, what they used to call a spinster, you did. You had more power. And that's actually going to kind of fit into the backdrop for one of the worst moments in period two, the Salem witch trials. Because if you look at it, there were a disproportionate number of women who were accused of witchcraft. And of those women, many of them were older single women, and they kind of got singled out and targeted. All right, so that's your period two background. Now, College Board, when they talk about contextualization for period three, again, period three is what we call the causes and effects of the American Revolution. So everything that you talk about has to end up being in that somehow. If we're looking at key concepts, all right, and contextualization, we're contextualizing. We're explaining the idea in which America gained independence and developed a sense of national identity. So now what we're saying is somehow either the question of women's rights helped create that national identity and independence, or more realistically, America gaining its independence and creating a national identity brought up issues of women's rights. Think of it this way, and I'm reading straight from the College Board, from the course description. The ideals that inspired the revolutionary cause reflected new beliefs about politics, religion, and society, women's rights, that had been developing over the course of the 18th century. So you can really point to the revolution of itself as an agent of change. So when we look at women's rights, again, do them within the context of the revolution. Colonial efforts were inspired by Enlightenment ideas in popular movements, which we'll get into in a little bit. Things like the Daughters of the American Revolution. Women played a major role in the revolution. Remember, the revolution is going to cause economic shortages, going to cause all kinds of major economic strains, and women are going to step in to fill these roles to help do their patriotic duty, and in some cases, even combat. The big historical thinking skill for period three that College Board likes, and they kind of outline this, is this idea of continuity and change over time. The ideals that inspired the revolutionary cause reflected new beliefs about politics, society, and religion. Again, this idea of new ideals about politics, society, and religion. What changed during the course of this time period? What stayed the same, particularly when it came to women? Big topic right away is this idea of Republican motherhood. That as a result of women participating in the revolution, and in the revolution itself, and the idea, the revolutionary ideals about all men are created equal, Enlightenment ideals about natural rights, that this idea of Republican motherhood comes about. And it called on women to teach Republican values within the family. The idea that the mom is going to be the first teacher. And in our republic, because we were going to have our citizens participate in the democracy, well, at least the white male citizens, that women would be important because they would be the teachers of those values. The best example of Republican motherhood, think Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife. She does an amazing job educating her children, particularly John Quincy, who goes on to be so well educated. He's actually one of the smartest presidents we've ever had. And he becomes president. All right. So I gave you some key terms that you can use if you're going to build a case to talk about, changing ideals and Republican motherhood. The Daughters of Liberty. We talk a lot about the Sons of Liberty. The Daughters of Liberty did a lot of stuff. They would organize homespun spinning bees because we were boycotting British clothing. So they would create homespun cloth out of whatever they can get. We boycott tea. They try to brew tea out of other stuff, including stuff like raspberry leaves and strawberry leaves, which one of those I've been told has a very high laxative effect. So we might have been a stinky place in the world in the 1770s. Phyllis Wheatley, who not only was a woman, but was a slave. She wrote a book of poetry, and her most famous poem was about George Washington. So now you can take that to a whole nother level. Some women actively fought in the revolution. I've got hyperlinks on the presentation tonight to Molly Pitcher, who, when her husband was wounded at the Battle of Monmouth, put down her jugs of water and helped ban a cannon. Deborah Sampson, who went full-fledged Mulan, dressed up like a dude to fight. Um, Women played all kinds of vital economic roles in the American Revolution. They served as nurses. Again, they had to run their households, they had to run their farms, and they had to pick up a lot of the slack throughout American history. Holy continuities that during wars, when the men are out fighting, women increased their participation economically, socially, and then as a result, they wanted to have more of a political stake. Again, this idea of Republican motherhood. Now, if you're going to have a republic, our founding fathers had these crazy ideas that you needed to have educated voters. That's why, if you're looking at other events during this time period, you have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which created the process for bringing new states in the Union. And part of that Northwest Ordinance said you had to have a public school in every township. It kind of reinforced this idea of education. And again, who are the first educators going to be? Jake wants to know, did the creation of the Daughters of Liberty have any impact on the societal role of women? Jake, absolutely. Because again, American women were taking an active role in the revolution. They were pre-fighting. Again, they were helping with the boycotts in terms of, if you're going to say you're going to boycott British goods, you've got to come up with alternatives to them. During the war itself, they were collecting pewter, lead, and any other types of metal they could to melt down to create bullets. And again, if you've got all these men fighting, they're going to step up and fulfill those roles in local towns, in their economic systems, and they are going to end up having to run households. And again, the best example is Abigail Adams. Now, there's a great book if you ever get a chance, John Adams. Okay, creative title. HBO did a mini series years back. It's phenomenal if you can find it. The guy who plays Tony Soprano is John Adams. You know, Abigail Adams, she went through all these crazy stresses while John Adams was gone. There was a smallpox epidemic. And this was right around the time that the smallpox vaccine was created. And Abigail Adams, she dragged her kids down to where the vaccinations were going to be when everybody else in her town was afraid to get inoculated with a virus. I mean, like, you can understand why. Abigail Adams rolled up her sleeves and said, here, take care of our family first. Because if we'll do it, you guys should be doing it. Abigail Adams and John Adams, during period 3, before, during, and after the revolution, they're separated for so much time. And they really have one of the coolest love stories in American history. First of all, John Adams recognized he totally outkicked his coverage. Abigail Adams was so beyond his scoring range. And she never let him forget it. She would put him in his place when he got a little too full of himself. And her most famous line, of course, was "Remember the ladies." Now, I got a great hyperlink and I've got a video about Abigail Adams. A lot of people think she was talking about voting rights. The problem was, for women like Abigail Adams in the 1700s and into the early 1800s, voting rights was so far down there. She was talking more about protection from domestic abuse, protection in terms of women not having custody of their children, not having any legal rights whatsoever. Okay? And she, like I said, she was really good. She could tease him. She was playful. If you learn how to do some historical reading, you read her letters, you're like, holy cow, they were steamy. But she would also sass him and kind of tease him. And she always knew how to kind of knock him down a notch or two. I also threw in a link to a woman named Judith Sargent Murray. Judith Sargent Murray in 1779 wrote a book called On the Equality of the Sexes. Now you can again point to the American Revolution as, look, what a change agent that is, that those revolutionary ideals of, all men are created equal are now being applied to say, hey, well, what about women? Anna, any songs we could use for synthesis? Oy vey. Well, Anna, this is where I'm so bummed out. We got sidetracked, obviously, for more important reasons. But yeah, Anna, there's a story. All right, so let's go back in time. Okay, forward in time. Ready? So we learned about the Boston Massacre in 1770. It led to 5 members of the Sons of Liberty, including Crispus Attucks, being killed. It became a major propaganda tool for the Patriot cause. Sam Adams was the one who actually came up with the name Boston Massacre. Paul Revere, yeah, that Paul Revere. He was a silversmith by trade. He made a silver engraving of the Boston Massacre, and it was circulated widely throughout the colonies. So you take this idea of naming something, kind of making it notorious, stamping into people's brains. 200 years later, May 4th, 1970, there was an anti-war protest at a college called Kent State University. Kent State is in Ohio, and this is the synthesis I always tell kids for the Boston Massacre. There was an anti-war protest against the Vietnam War. The Ohio National Guard was called in. We don't know why, but the National Guard ended up opening fire, and 4 of the protesters were killed. So Neil Young, who was a rock star, he's like, those classic rock stations that your parents, maybe even your grand. Neil Young created a song called Ohio. Okay. And Ohio, the famous lyric is Tin Soldiers and Nixon coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming for dead in Ohio. And so that connection to Neil Young's Ohio and Kent State you could use for the Boston Massacre. Lily, can we see increased women's participation in all major wars? Lily, you can in some way, shape, or form. We talked a lot about the Civil War. Women worked as nurses, cooks, scout. Harriet Tubman was a scout and a spy during the Civil War. Women worked to fulfill the economic roles that their husbands left behind. World War I and World War II, they're in factories. And I'll spin it on you. During Vietnam, women become very big participants in the anti-war movement, in the protest movements. Let's see here. We got a few more questions. Let's roll with some questions for a little bit here. Liv, what important men were supporters of women gaining rights during this time period? Well, if you look at it overtly, not a lot, Liv. Trying to think. I'll have to get back to you on that one. All right. Now, in period 3, I've got some documents here. And if you get a chance to check out the documents, the first one is a letter written from a Philadelphia woman in 1776. And I ask you in that one to think about the historical context that explains why the author made her statements. And I want to use this as a quick exercise, so bear with. If you've got access to it, great. If you don't have access to it, I'll read it to you like it's story time, since I'm in my 6-year-old's bedroom. All right. So I'm asking you, what historical context explains the statements made by the author? And that's the thing. When you do something like historical context, guys, it's not just, okay, here's the context, here's what's going on. Use the context to explain why this person would have said this. What would have compelled the person either to create the document or to have the point of view? Like, one thing can cause another. The context can lead a person to do this. I will tell you what I have done. I have retrenched every superfluous expense in my table and family. In other words, I've cut down on my spending. Tea. I have not drunk since last Christmas, nor bought a new cap or gown. I have learned to knit and am now making stockings of American wool for my servants. And this way do I throw in my mite to the public good. I know this, that as free I can die but once, but as a slave I shall not be worthy of life. So she's talking about how she's been involved in colonial boycotts. No tea. Only American wool for clothing. She's cut down her spending. She's not buying British goods. She's participating in these boycotts. Now, tie this in again with the idea of context. Why? Because Americans, by 1776, the fighting has already begun. Not only has she already been boycotting British goods, but now she's doing her help to support the Patriot cause. You could speculate. Perhaps she's, hey, point of view perspective, maybe, we can't tell, but maybe she's a member of the Daughters of Liberty too. Or at least she's certainly a patriot, someone who's supporting the cause of the revolution. All right, we're going to now start to move out of period 3. I've got one document up there. There's a guy named Benjamin Rush. Now, Benjamin Rush was a physician. He was a doctor. He is an important participant in the American Revolution, and he becomes one of the leading proponents. And Liv, I think this answers your question a little bit. Benjamin Rush, you can point to as a big advocate for this idea of Republican motherhood. He wrote a document called Thoughts Upon Female Education. And I just want to read this to you. The equal share that every citizen has in the liberty and the possible share he may have in the government of our country make it necessary that our ladies should be qualified to a certain degree by a peculiar and suitable education to concur in instructing their sons in the principles of liberty and government. Now, he's an advocate for educating women. Yay! He's an advocate for educating women so that women can educate their sons to be voters. But it's a step and it's a creation of a role. All right, now we're moving into period 4 because in the comments I'm getting people blowing me up with period 4 questions and I love it. All right, Helena, how did the American Revolution add momentum to the women's rights movement? I think, Helena, that's the big thing you want to get out of period 3. The idea that participation in the boycotts, in stuff like the Daughters of the Revolution, Daughters of Liberty, participation in revolutionary war efforts, whether it's supporting our troops or, again, taking economic activity during the war, and then that idea of Republican motherhood, all of those things kind of charged the idea that women wanted to carve out a greater and greater role. Throw in a little hot sauce from the Enlightenment, and you can see where we're going to be moving. All right, Allie, what caused the switch from the cult of Republican motherhood to the cult of domesticity? Allie, you must be psychic because you pretty much set up exactly where I wanted to go there. All right, it's a war. One of the things on May 15th, if you get a war, and let's be real, periods 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you got plenty of wars, guys. One of the things I kind of drilled in your heads this year, war brings change. The War of 1812 is the most important tie in the history of America. It's a tie because nobody loses or gains any territory. With the Treaty of Ghent, it was called status quo ante bellum. But what it does do is it spurs economic change in America. It leads Henry Clay to develop his idea called the American system. The idea that we should be self-sufficient, that up in the north, we should have factories to produce manufactured goods. Down south, have cash crops, especially cotton. Out west, grow food crops. Well, this is going to lead to all kinds of economic changes. This American system begins what we now think of as the market revolution or early industrialization in America. And it's going to lead to some changes. For one thing, more people start to work in factories than in farms. Now, not on the scale that we see in the late 1800s during the Gilded Age. But now, because you have more people working in factories, children are no longer as much of an economic asset. If you grew up on a farm, mom and dad had lots of kids because that's lots of farm hands. But now, all of a sudden, if dad's working in a factory, kids are just another mouth to feed. Wait till you have kids someday and you see your grocery bill and you go, oh my gosh. So you get that change. You also get the creation of what are called separate spheres. That men, prior to the market revolution, you got mom and dad, they're kind of bumping elbows. They're next to each other. They're working together on the farm. Again, think John and Abigail Adams. Now, after the War of 1812 and this market revolution, hubby goes off to work. And the wife either stays home or if she does have a job, it tends to be an occupation that's more closely related to domestic skills. Cook, teacher, a seamstress, a domestic servant, like a house cleaner, something like that. And what it does is this market revolution, it leads the creation of this idea called separate spheres. That you have the man's world over here, and that the man's world is all about money, politics. And the woman's separate sphere, it's her special blessing. I think how sexist this is. It's her special blessing that she is weak, the weaker sex, the quote, fairer sex, because it gives her a special talent, a special skill to deal with children and to be nurturing and loving, and that the woman's job is the moral and religious and physical upbringing and care of the family, or what we call the cult of domesticity. Now, it's really sexist. Let's be real. It does, however, lead to big societal changes because the joke I made in class was, Hell hath no fury like a soccer mama scorned. If you are, forcing into the heads of American women that this is your special job, your gift from God, the safety and the upbringing of the children, well, careful what you ask for. Because one of the things the market revolution does, it starts to lead to more people being in the middle class. Middle class women have more leisure time. Middle class women have more money, more economic security, which means they can devote to causes, to reforms, especially causes that might help improve the lives, the safety, and the morality of their children. At the same time, you have this new phenomena. The Second Great Awakening happens. And the Second Great Awakening, one of the big differences between the first and the second was that in the second, it was no longer good enough to be a good Christian. You don't sin. It was, no, no. A Christian must fight against sin and evil wherever they see it. So you throw in hot sauce from the Great Awakening. You throw in a very clearly defined role of the cult of domesticity or separate spheres. And then you throw in Jackson juice. Remember, in the 1820s and 30s, you had the Age of Jackson and this idea of equality. You get a push. More and more people can vote because states dropped the property requirement. And they called it universal male suffrage. That during this time period, basically, if you were a white male, you can vote. Well, if now you've increased voter participation, would that also make some women start to go, well, what's up with that? When do we get to vote? And oh, by the way, society's saying you're responsible for the safety and the morality of your children. And, you've been going to a Second Great Awakening revival. It's like the perfect storm for reforms. All right. Let's see here. Sarah, I hope I answered your question. If not, shoot me a comment. All right. Oakley, why didn't John Adams do anything for women's rights as president when his wife Abigail was such a big advocate? I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know that there was enough of a push for it at the time. I mean, if you think about it, change happens very slowly in American history. I think you also need to remember that John Adams was a one-term president, and that during that one term he was preoccupied with the quasi-war with France. All right, let's see here. Sarah, again, I hope I answered your question right. Logan, what are some of the major outcomes of the Seneca Falls Convention? We're going to get to that. Rob, did women's roles change in any way as a result of the American Revolution? Wait till we get to Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Bennett, who were the first women to actively speak out for women's rights and when? All right, well, let's move on here. So we have period 4. Now, period 4 I called the age of Jefferson to the age of Jackson. It goes 1800 with the election of Thomas Jefferson, the so-called Revolution of 1800, and it ends in 1848 when James K. Polk leaves office. Polk, who's often called Young Hickory. So it's the age of Jefferson and the age of Jackson. Now, what's the big common thread here? During this time period, if we're contextualizing it straight from College Board, we're trying to contextualize the development of our republic. And this idea of the role of the common man. Now, remember, when Jefferson gets elected, Jefferson plays this up as a revolution that, I'm a common man. Well, he's rich. He walks to his inauguration for a symbolic type of thing. And Jackson really launches this revolution that people think of as a revolution of the common man. So during this time period, one of the big trends you see is increased voter participation. The other thing is you see these reform movements. And again, both the Jackson presidency and the Jefferson presidency, at least the ideals they embody, are going to have an influence on this. So when we contextualize period 4, we want to think the idea that, in our nation, the fact that we're transitioning to having more people participate in our democracy, universal male suffrage, it's going to lead to a growth of other movements. Okay? We talked about the economic factors as well. The other big thing, and I see that Helena just threw this question in there, the role of the West. This is the decade where you see Manifest Destiny kicked off. And if I say Manifest Destiny, you say, go West, young man, go West. It starts with the Louisiana Purchase. And as we're moving west, the fact that you always have a Western frontier, there's a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. I referenced him before. He's a good dude to have in your contextualization for periods 4 and 5. The historian who said all of American history has been shaped by the fact that we had a frontier. Turner points to the idea that the West was always more democratic. And in many ways, he's right. It's hard to say man's role, woman's role, that's woman's work, where, if we don't make the log cabin, we're going to die. In fact, fast forward 1889, the first state that granted women's suffrage was Wyoming. In fact, the first states that gave women's suffrage as a group were the Western states. And there were many states that granted women's suffrage prior to the 19th Amendment, but the West led the way. So you have this big confluence, SAT word, Western frontier, more democratic, Jacksonian ideals, at least the symbolism of, more participation in government, universal male suffrage, hey, why not us? Cult of domesticity, market revolution, little hot sauce from the Second Great Awakening, and you have all these factors that are going to lead to women's rights. So go back to that Second Great Awakening. Because you have the Second Great Awakening, all kinds of new voluntary organizations get formed, all kinds of reform movements in one way, shape, or form. And for women especially, anything that was sinful that seemed like it would hurt the family. And that's going to lead to reforms. College Board for period 4, kids, loves causation. So in period 3, I told you they liked continuity and change over time. Period 4, they love this idea of causation. So dig this. Changes in the market revolution, or changes caused by the market revolution, led to significant changes in society, especially stuff like gender roles. So, market revolution now leads to changes, this idea of cult of domesticity. This is your job. At the same time, there's another big causal factor, that's Second Great Awakening, which says sin is bad, sin threatens your children. You put the two together, reform ideals are created. The idea in the Jacksonian time that, look, if more people can vote, more people can have a say and change things, that comes together with it. So what do you get? Temperance. One of the biggest reforms of the 1800s. How successful was the temperance movement? Well, we know eventually the 18th Amendment, but that's not going to be until 1919. But in the short term, in 1851, Maine became the first dry state. Maine became the first state to be booze-free, and it would not be the last. You have Dorothy Dix, Massachusetts school teacher. She's going to lead for the reform of mental institutions. You're going to have a public school movement led by Horace Mann of Massachusetts, but that gets a lot of support from American women. You're going to get the creation of colleges and schools for women. The Troy Female Seminary was created. Mount Holyoke College, Oberlin College, admitted women. Eventually, you're going to get Elizabeth Blackwell from Syracuse. In fact, right by SU, there's Elizabeth Blackwell Boulevard or Avenue. First woman to go to medical school. You're going to get women involved in other reforms. Abolition. In fact, Quaker women became some of the earliest people who were strong advocates for the abolition of slavery. And if you look at some of the early abolitionists, people like Lucretia Mott was a Quaker. Why? Because the Quakers believed everybody could understand the Holy Spirit. Everybody had, quote, God's inner light. The earliest abolitionists, many of them were from the South. Sarah and Angelina Grimke of South Carolina, the Grimke sisters. And not only did they write and speak out against slavery, one of the Grimke sisters married an African-American man, which caused a big scandal, but they also became some of the biggest advocates of women's rights. And that's an important note. This will make your essay look good if you have to do it in the AP test. They're not in a vacuum. A lot of these antebellum reform movements of the Second Great Awakening, they kind of crisscross. In 1840-something, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were leaders of their local abolitionist societies. They went to the World Abolitionist Convention in London, England, and they expected they would be allowed to sit up on stage, be treated with respect, and have a turn to speak like the other leaders of other organizations. Instead, they were told, you're not speaking, and you have to go sit behind the curtain. And when they left that conference, it was Stanton who said, we've been fighting for other people our whole lives. We have no rights of our own. Now go to Seneca Falls Convention. Seneca Falls, right in the Finger Lakes, not too far from us. In 1848, when you had the Seneca Falls Convention, which was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they take the Declaration of Independence and they tweak it. They turn it into what's called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, or very often just the Declaration of Sentiments. And they really take the American Revolution's declaration and they tweak it. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. And instead of a breakup letter declaring independence from the king, it's a letter declaring independence from men, saying, women, it's our turn to get our rights. At the Seneca Falls Convention, they had a lot of people speak. One of those prominent speakers was Frederick Douglass, an African-American man, a former slave, a runaway slave, an abolitionist. Why? Because Douglass realized, look, white women didn't have many rights, but they had more rights and they had more of it in than African-Americans. So again, you see like this confluence, two reform groups coming together. What made Elizabeth Cady Stanton really get involved in women's rights? She married Henry Stanton. When she was Elizabeth Cady, she married Henry Stanton, who was an abolitionist. Prior to that, Elizabeth Cady, her uncle was Gerrit Smith. In 1839, there was a slave named Harriet Powell, and they did a daring rescue. They helped Harriet Powell, who was owned by people visiting Syracuse from up in Tennessee, and they did a real kind of covert Mission Impossible raid. They dressed her up in guys' clothes, and they hid her out in this. Gerrit Smith was one of the richest guys in America. Hid her out in her house, and while they were arranging transport, Gerrit Smith made Elizabeth Cady, his niece, sit down and have a conversation with Harriet Powell. And she said that changed her life. Okay? Best example I can give you, and I put a link on there. Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was originally named Isabella Baumfree. She was a slave in Ulster County, downstate New York. She escaped north, changed her name to Sojourner Truth. And she became a very powerful speaker, not just against slavery, but also for women's rights. Oh. All right, pardon me, I need a drink. Talking too much. All right. So I've got a couple things on there about Seneca Falls. I mentioned the colleges, Holyoke and Oberlin. Dorothy Dix, I mentioned, Sojourner Truth, Temperance, Cult of Domesticity. Again, remember, at the time of the Seneca Falls Convention, yes, women's suffrage was a topic. It wasn't the topic. Why? Women had almost no legal protection when it came to things like domestic violence. They couldn't initiate their own divorces. They couldn't even keep the pay they made from work. Their property, anything they made, they couldn't testify in court unless they had their husband's permission. Alexa, turn on James's light. There you go. That's a little better. All right. This is in the PowerPoint, but I'm giving it to you anyway. A little primary source document. And if you look at it, it's historical context time. It's a chart. And it's a graph, actually, and it shows you the occupations of women in the 1800s, in the year 1857 specifically. What were the jobs that women were doing? The number one job for women in Massachusetts in 1857, hats. 48.6% of the hat makers in Massachusetts were women. Now, again, you want proof of the cult of domesticity? Okay, it was acceptable for women to have the job of hat maker. Why? That involves sewing and doing stuff with cloth, and that's a domestic skill. Coming in second place, 17.3%, textiles. Hey, let me see it in the comments right now. Come on. What's the name of those textile mills that women worked in pre-Civil War? Come on, I want to see that comment, guys. Come on, make me feel good. Waiting. What's the name of that textile mill? The town that young, unmarried women would work in. Anyone got it? I'm waiting for it. Other jobs. They could make boots and shoes. Again, it's kind of connected to a domestic skill. Domestic service, being a maid or a housekeeper. Teaching. That's why, really, guys, throughout American history, teaching has been like a a very woman-dominated profession. Making garments and other types of clothing. And yes, good job, Faith, the Lowell Mill. Okay? Now, explain the context. Why? Why is that the job? Because you have this prevailing view of the cult of domesticity that there's, quote, women's work. And therefore, it's acceptable for women to actually have professions that are related somehow to domestic service. You can contextualize that also by bringing up the fact that, young unmarried girls worked in those Lowell mills. I've got a document, I've got an excerpt on there from the Declaration of Sentiments. All right, now period 5, last period for the day. This is 1844, the election of James K. Polk, the guy who gets in the Mexican War. 1844 is also one of the years that the Liberty Party runs a candidate. It ends in 1877, the end of Reconstruction. Period 5 is causes and effects of the revolution. So if you get a DBQ about period 5, you in your contextualization or in your essay in general, you got to connect to this idea that, look, this is the time period that deals with what caused or what resulted from the gosh darn Civil War. Did I say revolution before? I'm sorry, Civil War. I'm mesmerized by all the planets. If you're nice to me, I'll turn off the lights later and you can see them glow in the dark. Okay? So if we talk about women's rights in period 5, guys, then we have to do it within the context of how does it fit into the factors that caused the Civil War, or how does it fit into the results of it? Abolition especially. That during this time period, people are debating what it means to be a citizen. They're also debating the question of what it means to be free. That there are abolitionists who are women. There are abolitionists who are white women. There are abolitionists like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman who are black women. That women will play a key role in not just what caused the Civil War, but then they will play a key role in the Civil War and then afterward. All right, another key idea. The women's rights movement is going to get more determined than ever, but they're also going to get divided up by the 14th and 15th Amendments. Remember, we said, or at least I said, on the fat guy yapping on your screen here, that the abolitionists and the women's rights leaders worked hand in hand prior to the Civil War. After the war, now all of a sudden you get the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal rights and citizenship to all males. Overtly says males. So African Americans become citizens with equal rights as long as they're males. 15th Amendment gives suffrage, the right to vote, to African American males. So in a way, in the minds of many of these women's rights leaders, they've now been knocked even further down in status. You're underneath white men and African American men. And it's actually going to lead to some people in the women's rights movement getting a real nasty turn with some of the language and some of the stuff that they use. Now, it's going to go from what caused the Civil War and even spill into the effects of it in Reconstruction. All right, women that we talk about during this time period. Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is the best example of all these ideas kind of wrapped up into one. In 1850, the Compromise of 1850 was passed to try to settle, because one of you guys had a question about the Mexican War, to settle the question of, slavery in the Mexican territories. And the most controversial part of that compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act, which now said, it took an idea that was in the Constitution. The Constitution had a clause that said states should cooperate with the return of slaves. But now it mandates it. And it basically says that, bounty hunters must be assisted. And now this idea of slavery is not just like an abstract idea that, women in abolitionist societies might say, oh, it's shameful, it's bad. Now it's actually in your face. In Syracuse, New York, we have the famous Jerry rescue that happens in 1851. There was an incident in Boston where President Fillmore had to call the army in to line the streets to escort one slave to a ship to go back down south. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now let's put all these ideas together. Ready? Cult of domesticity. She's a mother. She's a housewife. Second Great Awakening. She is the daughter of a minister. She comes from a very religious family. She's an abolitionist. The Beecher family, her maiden name, they were big in the temperance movement. In 1851, she has an infant son die from a cholera epidemic. A friend of her family was the Reverend Elijah Lovejoy. He was murdered by pro-slavery people in Illinois. Harriet Beecher Stowe thought that God was cursing and punishing America with plagues, with violence, with disease, just like God punished the Egyptians in the Bible in the book of Exodus. And she thought that the sin that America was committing was slavery. So what did she do? She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, the book itself is a really... The bad guys are so bad, they just need like the black mustache and the black hat. The good guys are so good at stereotypical. African American are depicted as like childlike, so there's like that tinge of racism in it. But in the book, Tom is a Christ metaphor. Everything about Tom is this idea of, a Jesus metaphor. Tom has a chance to escape. He says, no, I can't do that. If I do, I'm so valuable. Everybody else will have to be sacrificed to save me. At the end of the book, Tom is whipped to death as he is held with his arms outstretched by his own fellow slaves. And right before he dies, he forgives everybody. So she combines the emotions of the Second Great Awakening and the cult of domesticity and abolition. And that's why when Abe Lincoln met her during the Civil War, he said, so you're the little lady who started the big war. And that sold more copies than any book in America except for the Bible. All right, let's see here. Roles women played during the Civil War. I've got a cool little thing in there for you. There were women who served all kinds of roles. Nurses. Again, Harriet Tubman, the best example. She didn't just do the Underground Railroad. She was called Moses because she made 19 trips and supposedly freed over 300 slaves. Now, I've seen different articles that say those numbers might be conflicted either way. What she does is amazing. Well, because she is so adept and skilled at, knowing the terrain and being stealthy during the Civil War, she led raids on the South. She was a spy. She was a scout. Women did all kinds of different professions. Again, because men weren't there, women had to take a larger economic activity. Clara Barton became a famous nurse during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, Clara Barton founded an organization you've all probably heard of, the Red Cross. But again, this question of the 14th and 15th Amendment and the fact that women were purposefully left out of it, it kind of started to get a new direction for women's suffrage. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony and 15 housewives walked in and registered and voted in Rochester, New York. A day or two later, knock at the door, knock, 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 knock. Ma'am, you got to come with us. You broke the law. And Susan B. Anthony was arrested. That's an act of civil disobedience. Go back to Henry David Thoreau. Go forward to Martin Luther King. All right, a couple of quick documents, and then we'll do some of the questions if I didn't do a good enough job. I've got a document on here. It's kind of a good point of view type of thing. It'll show you the idea of separate spheres and, quote, what a woman's place is. I have a document from a woman named Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs was a slave. Her documents, it's from a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And if you read it, I want you to figure out why white women might be the intended audience. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I've got a letter written from a frontier woman in Iowa to relatives. Again, think about this idea that if you live along the frontier, it's a more democratic society. Why? Just out of necessity. And I put a quick little video in there as well. Some other women in American history. All right, let me look at your questions here. Sorry for all the movement. My back is all spazzy, so I've got to move around. Warner, were there any individuals who specifically spoke out against women's rights? None of note. Just again, take the idea of the counter argument was that women, they're physically weaker. They're the, quote, fairer sex. Now, part of this is because of the way women dressed. Women in the 1800s would wear petticoats and like layers of clothing. Guys, we hate getting sweaty. Women were wearing layers and layers and layers of clothing. They would wear these metal hoops to kind of puff their dresses out, and they would wear these corsets that would basically be like a jacket almost and you'd pull and tighten these ropes. And women who would wear these corsets in the 1800s, they would very often get broken ribs. Their internal organs would get like squished and like moved around. The old stereotype in the movies was when a woman got too excited, you'd see, oh, she'd faint. Well, you know why she was fainting? Because she couldn't even flip and breathe. Okay. That's why later on in the 1800s, we're going to get Amelia Bloomer, who causes a bit of a stir when she comes up with a new way to dress. Okay. Let's see here. Gino, were African American women afforded the benefits of the cult of domesticity? No. I mean, if you think about it this way, Gino, if you are an African American woman in the 1800s, especially during periods 4 and 5, you are statistically speaking more than likely going to be a slave. In fact, you have a whole nother issue to worry about. Rape. You know, I'm not going to dance around it. It was very, very common for Southern slave owners to view their female slaves as their property and that they could do anything they wanted to them. Plus, they would do it for economic reasons because if they had forced relations with a slave woman, they could make more children. And remember, the rule about slavery was it was called chattel, Chattel, slavery. Chattel slavery, so that your children were slaves. You know, best examples, Thomas Jefferson. We know that Thomas Jefferson more than likely had like 6 children with Sally Hemings, an even scarier, more difficult time. Kate, which women are the most important to talk about in a DBQ about women's rights? Well, Kate, if we're doing this time period, 3, 4, 5, Abigail Adams, you know, helped set that off with Cult of Republican Motherhood. Certainly Elizabeth Cady Stanton with Seneca Falls, Susan B. Anthony with Seneca Falls, and Lucretia Mott. And I would definitely throw in Harriet Beecher Stowe because although she's not a women's rights leader, you could certainly say, look, women were involved in other reform movements. Again, the Beecher family, they were involved in temperance. Stowe was an abolitionist. You could also talk about Sojourner Truth. Faith, who was the first president to purposely try to improve women's rights? Well, it's kind of funny you say that. How about the first former president? In 1912, when my boy Teddy, I should have brought the Teddy action figure in here. When Teddy ran as the Progressive Bull Moose Party candidate, he actively courted female voters. Remember, there were many, many states that had already given women the right to vote, and Teddy spoke out pro-women's suffrage. I guess you could say the first president who, you know, did more for women after women already had suffrage was FDR. He put the first woman in the cabinet, Frances Perkins. Some of the New Deal programs specifically were targeted to help women, but that's tomorrow night. Oh, by the way, did I mention that we're doing YouTube tomorrow night? Can't do Thursday. Let's see here. Faith, we did that. Helena, we talked about yours. Let's see here. Matt, at what point did the women's rights movement start working with African Americans and why? Matt, I hope I answered your question. If not, rewind about 15 minutes ago. We talked about, you know, like Frederick Douglass speaking at Seneca Falls and the fact that Stanton and Mott and the Grimke's were both abolitionists and women's rights leaders. Do we have any other questions, guys? Is there something that I missed? Faith, you on the Lowell Mill? Lowell Mills. In the 1830s and 40s, Lowell, which is a town in Massachusetts, most of the textile mills in America were up in New England because most of the textile mills, well, all factories early in American history, they needed water wheels. You need waterfalls, rapids, fast-moving rivers to power your factories. So what happened was you had a lot, geologically, there's a lot more fast-flowing streams in the north than there are in the south. And in Massachusetts, the town of Lowell, they had these factories, and they would recruit. They'd put out ads for young girls who lived out in the country, like high school girls, advertise to families and convince them that, look, have your daughter come work in these factories. She's going to make money, which will improve her dowry. A girl's dowry was like, it was called her wedding chest. The idea that when a guy married her, hey, here's your money. It'll teach her hard work. It'll teach her how to be industrious. In reality, they got really crappy working conditions. They lived in these dorms. They had to like scarf down their food. If they were so much as a minute late, they'd be docked half a day's pay. And it really wasn't a great situation for them because they're women, B, they're young women. And so they can easily be exploited. They have very few rights. In fact, Eventually, they're going to have those jobs taken away. Who's going to replace the little girls? The Irish. Okay. Any other questions, guys? So tomorrow you're going to make a period 3 study guide, and we will do a review class Wednesday. On Friday, you're going to do a DBQ. And please check out that Google slide I made you. I put a lot of hyperlinks in. I think you guys will like it. Just even if you just do a cursory glance, I hope it'll help you go all the way through. It'll be worth your time. And until then, log off and plug in your Chromies, homies. I'll see you later, guys. Bye.